Hello. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event. An evening with former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Lord Blunkett, and the government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Rt Hon KC. They will be guided in conversation by CEG's Senior Legal Fellow, Lord Carlile KC, also a former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. If there is a collective noun for independent reviewers of terrorism legislation, we have it on the stage. Yes, I think that's it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hannah Stewart, and I'm the director of the Counter Extremism Group. We're a think tank founded in 2020 to provide practical policy solutions to the growth of extremist ideologies. It's my great pleasure to be joined tonight by such impressive speakers for what is now our 5th annual public lecture, so thank you all. They bring a wealth of experience and expertise in national security, and they have all, in different ways, had what I think is an awesome and perhaps unenviable or enviable task of passing and scrutinising counter-terrorism measures designed to protect our country and its people and its interests, while at the same time trying to maintain civil liberties and social cohesion. A very hard task indeed, and I very much look forward to hearing their views on these issues tonight. Tonight's event, as many of you will be aware, is also the flagship event of our CEG Young Leaders in National Security Fellowship, which is a residential course we hold for young people interested in this area in the first week of September every year. Lord Carlile and Lord Blunkett have kindly agreed to head this year's programme, and together we hope to help our fellows pursue careers in counter-terrorism, extremism and related fields. It's really lovely to see so many of our alumni here tonight, and just wonderful to see how well you are all progressing in your careers. So thank you for coming back to us. Just a small bit of housekeeping. Tonight's conversation is on the record, and we'll be making it available on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to post on social media. And finally, please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Hannah. Are the microphones working? Yes, I think so. Right. Well, of course, there are 4 of us up here on the stage, so for those of you who are curious, the 4th is Barley.
And he's truly on the far left.
Yeah, he's never moved as far to the right as you, has he, David? No, it's a pleasure to be here with 2 very good friends, David Blunkett and Rt Hon. And the aim of this evening's programme is to really give you the chance to hear what my colleagues want to say, what I have to say, and also to give you, above all, the prospect of asking questions. The only thing I have to say about questions is when you ask your question, will you very clearly give your name and what you're doing. And if you're a fellow this year, say, I'm a current fellow. And there are going to be 2 roving microphones going around the room so that you'll be heard by the older ones among us as I have a hearing aid. Right. So I'm going to start, if I may, David, with asking you a question. You were the Home Secretary, as I discovered, on the day of 9/11. They've heard that story. And so you had to deal with the aftermath of 9/11 at a time when really what we knew about was just Al-Qaeda, wasn't it? So how did things change on that day?
We knew about Al-Qaeda, but one of the issues that I think CEG have been looking at over the 5 years and will be in the future is a kind of well-meaning naivety that takes over when events take place and they're not clocked. So they're not thunderous clouds coming out of a blue sky. They're clouds that could be seen, and if you had the right meteorological office to do it, you would have spotted them. And in our case, in 1998, the attacks on the US embassies in East Africa were a forerunner to what happened on the 11th of September 2001. Inevitably, the government of John Major and ourselves had been heavily involved in terror from Ireland, and although the Good Friday Agreement had started the process of peace and stability, by 2000, we were still passing a terrorism act, the Terrorism Act 2000. It was primarily based on the experience of what had happened with the IRA and the Provos. And so in 2001, we were faced not only with what do we do now to protect the UK, because we all expected that the second attack, following the World Trade Center attack and the subsequent bringing down of the plane and what have you, would be in the City of London. And so taking immediate action to try and prevent that happening and to what we called alerting people but not alarming them was really crucial. The second bit was reassuring people so that we didn't have lack of social cohesion, so that we didn't have divisions based on people thinking that the person down the road who looked differently was automatically going to be a terrorist, whilst getting our counter-terrorism people to actually think who is likely to be involved in the franchise network that constituted Al-Qaeda. And of course all this is mixed up with the encampments in Afghanistan, where the training camps were taking place, and the need to intervene and deal with that. And of course we know the fiasco of what happened many years later. So it was a rude awakening, really, Alex, but it shouldn't have been. I mean, I was only there for 3 months before it happened, so I plead not guilty to naivety. But it dislocated everything else we were intending to do. And I said to the fellows this morning that I took the equivalent of a PhD in 3 months. My passing knowledge of law was an A-level in law. My knowledge of the brilliance of the makeup of the House of Lords was one created by resentment over many years in the House of Commons. And trying to take the new legislation, the anti-terrorism, crime and security legislation through in that timescale before Christmas was a major task. And I was helped, actually, in the end, by the chamber I never expected to be in, because the contribution of the House of Lords with the experience that was present there made an enormous difference to getting the bill right. We had one element, we'll come back to it, part 4 of the bill, which was about the certification of those who hadn't committed a crime, but who the security and intelligence services believed were a genuine threat, were in cahoots with and had connections with the network internationally, and that were going to be a real threat to our life and well-being. And what do we do about them? And I'll just finish on this. The challenge was this: all our systems, all our criminology systems are based on deterrent, the deterrent of being caught and prosecuted and imprisoned. But for Al-Qaeda, that wasn't a deterrent at all, not least because people were prepared to give their lives to be suicide bombers across the world in order to complete what the twisted logic of what they were being fed and incited to do. So we didn't have traditional mechanisms. There's no point in waiting until another event had taken place and then looking for them and prosecuting them. The task had to be, how do we intervene early, and what does that mean for the criminal justice system and for the balance between safeguarding the community and safeguarding civil liberties? And that was the big challenge.
And we had control orders, of course, not long
afterwards.
That.
Yeah. When the Law Lords, as it was just before the Supreme Court was created, struck down Part 4, we then brought in the control orders.
And I spent some time in prisons talking to people who were arrested without charge under control orders, and it was an unusual and interesting experience. I did spend 45 minutes in a cell on my own being shouted at by Abu Qatada on one occasion.
Well, I think that's something to be very proud of.
And just before...
I ought to tell this story. We had a hell of a job finding him.
Yes.
I mean, it was utterly bizarre. They came to me and said, Home Secretary, we've sent in a whole cohort of armed police. And I said, what do you mean you sent them in? They said, well, we surrounded the streets and closed down the roads. And I said, well, that was a good symbol, wasn't it, that you were on your way. So by the time they got to his house, he'd gone. And I said, given the mess up you've just made, I think you're beholden now to find him. And whatever it takes, find him.
Right, and just a reflection from you perhaps about what has changed in terms of the terrorism threat since that time. How do you see the terrorism threat proportionately compared with that time?
I think the one thing that the terrible loss of life did in the US was to shake people out of that complacency. It shook people to the core. So they were prepared to hear the voice of caution, of care, of warning, and to take it seriously. Of course, we had, both in public and in Parliament, quite rightly, the debate about proportionality and whether the act was going too far. It didn't go anywhere near as far as the Patriot Act in the States, but it was breaking new ground. And that debate has continued, but it's continued since 2005 in the UK, when we had the attack on the Underground and at Tavistock Square. It's continued in a benign environment where people may have seen terrorist attacks and suicide bombers and all the rest of it elsewhere in the world, but they've not felt it. And I think it's more difficult now, 20 years on from 2005, to have the dialogue we're having tonight and to get across people that in the shadows, behind the public face and infiltrating perfectly reasonable organisations with good intent, lies evil.
Turning to you, Jonathan, can I just ask you, picking up from the last theme of David's, about some of the legal structures that are now available? For example, the utility of prescription as a counter-terrorism measure, which is very topical at the moment, and whether you think that measures like prescription are being used proportionately or disproportionately?
Well, I suppose I was almost a bit disappointed when I began doing this job, and I go to the meetings where they decide whether to ban an organisation or whether they decide to remove controls on someone, these things called TPIMs, which are the equivalent of control orders. And I suppose I was sort of hoping I'll be able to add some value here because it'll be hopeless. But actually, it's done with immense professionalism. And I have, of all the stuff that I see, I think those large meetings with officials across Whitehall, well-led, plenty of challenge, I'm allowed to see everything, I'm allowed to say whatever I like and irritate everyone, I think are pretty effective. So I actually haven't seen evidence of real disproportionality. I think that there's obviously the risk of unintended consequences, and I think that's probably what you're more likely to see than out-and-out irrationality. I mean, if I can just pick up something that David was saying, which is about communication. It's not froth. I used to think comms was froth, but the more I've been doing this job, the more I think communication is really important, not just after 9/11, after 7/7, when the government comes out and says, we are not at war with Islam in that case, but also being able to say to the police, you have got a license to start asking uncomfortable questions. That's inevitably part of it. But also because there is less trust around now. We do have social media. People consult Grok, which is the AI for, as you all know, for X or Twitter. They will consult that as a source of authentic information. They will consult the below-the-line comments as much as they will listen to what the government or the police have got to say. So I think that the ability to carry on communicating about the steps the government is taking to counter terrorism, and also I think to accept sometimes when things go wrong, is even more important today because of that deficit of trust. And
social media was in its infancy 25 years ago. Now it's completely different and much more difficult to handle, Alex.
And if I can give us an example of how, in a way, counter-terrorism is never perfect. As Alex knows, the control orders were abolished under the coalition government. So Nick Clegg, as the price for entering in the coalition government with David Cameron, said, I want these outrageous measures to go. They then handed over this project and they said, well, look, we can't be doing without some sort of controls over individuals who can't be prosecuted, but we've got loads of intelligence to show they're up to no good, maybe even carrying out attack plans. And so they invented this thing called TPIMs. But they said, look, one thing you can't do is you cannot require one of these individuals to live outside their normal home. In other words, you can't require them to be relocated to Yorkshire or to Bournemouth or whatever, which I have to say is quite important if you are the security forces. Being able to remove someone from their home environment is quite important. That was abolished in the interests of civil liberties, I understand. But eventually, after 3 or 4 years, I remember David Anderson, my predecessor, did a report on this, and he said, do you know what? Actually, when it comes to it, the police really need that power, and so they changed the Act and they allowed individuals to be taken from their homes and taken away from their support networks. Now, that's an example, isn't it, of legitimate debate. You had strong civil liberties concerns. On the other hand, you had the practical reality, and this thing plays out in public. I'll end here. I suppose the point is we have to accept that we're never going to be always right about counterterrorism, but we do need to explain why it is happening.
Just a point that I think is for both of you, and it combines two elements. First of all, how trustworthy do you think the security services are? I have an opinion, which is that they're very trustworthy, but I'd be interested in your view. And also, what about the apparent differences that occur when, for example, it's decided to proscribe Palestine action, but not the IRGC? Is that based on a judgment that they are or are not terrorists, or is it based on a judgment about what's the best public policy approach, even if they are both terrorists? And does that dictate why the IRGC has not been proscribed yet, at least?
I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'd be
David,
more interested in what David's got to say.
I'm going to let Jonathan answer the last question.
Well, I mean, the reason they didn't prescribe the IRGC is because they accepted the view which I have expressed publicly, which is that the Terrorism Act was not designed to deal with state entities. And there's some wisdom. I think, Dave, and I think in Alex, in your report, you made the point about spy swaps. So if you have a state entity, MI6, and suddenly that individual is caught and they are prosecuted under the Terrorism Act of, say, Russia or Iran, it's hard to do these background deals. Anyway, the view is taken correctly, I think, by the government that you can't use terrorism legislation against state entities. Palestine action is not a state entity. No. And we can talk more about it, but that's the key difference.
Okay.
I think Palestine action is a very, very fine judgment. I voted for prescribing. We had an interesting, if short, debate in the House of Lords where very good colleagues of mine, like Peter Hain, expressed perfectly reasonable alternative views as to why this was not appropriate. Part of the problem is that you only know, I mean, I'm not going to do a Donald Rumsfeld, but you don't know the unknowns. You only know what you know, whereas those advising the Home Secretary, and having been there, this is inevitable, will have information and background on the leadership and those who have infiltrated an organisation like Palestine Action that will be profound in terms of the decision you take.
And that brings me to my first question about the reliability or
And do you
otherwise of
trust
the
them?
security services.
Well, my background in Sheffield, steeped in the historic trade union movement, was very suspicious indeed of the security services. MI5 historically had been used against the left. And so, I mean, I grew up in the era where Harold Wilson genuinely thought he was being done over. So I came into the Home Office not full of suspicion, but actually very wary. And I found over the 3.5 years I was there, with 2 different heads of MI5, that they were exemplary. It didn't mean that we always agreed. When we had the challenge of signing off around, in my day, it was around 2,500 orders a year for intercept, surveillance, tapping. Quite often I would send it back, but I always respected the incredible professionalism and credibility of what they were doing and their integrity. That was out of sheer being there and learning the lesson and questioning. And in the end, if you don't trust them, then you really can't deal with it.
Jonathan, you're not a politician. You're a very senior and highly admired lawyer, and no doubt are more objective sometimes, at least, than most politicians. What's your view of that issue about the security services?
I have to admit I've been given pause for thought, if I'm really candid, about the BBC case. So this is the case, Alex, where Daniel Samford is in the audience somewhere. Daniel Simone. Sorry, Daniel Simone is in the audience. Contacted, we now know from a judgment, was contacted by MI5, and it appears from a judgment in the High Court that what Daniel was told did not fit with what MI5 was saying to the court in legal proceedings. And I know that that's a live issue. I know that there's going to be an investigation by IPCO of that. And I suppose my approach, objectively, is, of course I'm a very trusting person, but I would never belong to any sort of club. I'm not a very sort of likeable, clubbable person. And my instinct, particularly when there is any evidence of something, is, I'm a skeptic. So I've always found them wonderful. I've always trusted them. I really hope, for the sake of us all actually, because of the important role that MI5 play, I really hope that someone does a really good and detailed job in getting to the bottom of what happened, because on the face of it, from what little I know, and I don't know all the stuff that below the line, on the face of it, it was quite bad.
Alex, if when Eliza Manningham Buller, who is now a colleague of ours in the Lords, was the head of MI5 for the bulk of the time I was there, if I thought for a minute that she would have authorised any of her operatives, officers, to brief the press, I'd have gone shit. She would never, ever have dreamt of... Can you imagine? Alex and Jonathan, you know her well. Can you imagine her countenancing? I wouldn't like to have been even the fly on the wall with the person who'd done it, because it would have... She's formidable.
But the first time I met Eliza Manningham Buller in her role as head of MI5, as I was leaving, she said, "I've got a little present for you," and I've still got it at home. It's a jar of jam that she'd made herself with a label that says, "A gift from MI5. Right, one other question and a different subject, and then we'll move to the floor. There have been suggestions that there should be an official Islamophobia definition. There is a definition of anti-Semitism that has an international background, and it seems to work reasonably well. But I think there are very mixed views about whether the government really should be looking for an Islamophobia definition, and if so, what kind of a definition would it be? Let's start with you, Jonathan.
I am against Islamophobia definition because it's directed at a thing, a religion, rather than it's an anti-Muslim hatred law, which is about protecting people. I am very conscious about the free speech debate. I'm not J.D. Vance, and I have a fundamental support for the outlines of the Online Safety Act, actually, even though, of course, it will be perfected because we're just at the foothills. So I'm not an absolutist, but I mean, if you think what happened today, I see that a comedian has been arrested at Heathrow for tweets. There appears to be a sort of degree of zealousness amongst some parts of law enforcement, and I suppose at the moment I wouldn't want to entrust something too spongy or inaccurate when it comes to speech and expression with the authorities.
David?
Well, just on the record, seeing we are on the record, Graham Lennon actually being picked up for remarks that he's made. On the information I have, I think it's totally inept. And I say so because I think when police and security services get it badly wrong, they play into the hands of our opponents, our enemies, the people who would undermine our freedom and democracy and our freedom of speech. So they play into a narrative, which of course the Americans have immediately come out with, which is that we're no longer believers in free speech, and of course we are. My answer to your fundamental question is you've got to develop a definition with those who are integral to the definition, and it's been possible to do that with the Jewish community internationally, and to understand that there are people on the far left who are vehemently against the definition, of course, because they claim it interferes with attack on the government of or the state of Israel. But at least there was an entity that we could talk to. It's very difficult to do that with a religion that is not linked to a nationality, and very difficult to do it outside the engagement with those for whom it's fundamentally involved. So that's why I would be very wary about it. We do know about hate. I mean, hate is something that has been fostered on the internet in a way that was never true when I was younger. I mean, the venom that you get on emails, never mind actually on social media posts, is something to behold. And somehow we've got to deal with that, because hate and bitterness, resentment and alienation are the breeding ground for everything that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah. So you've got, I think, 3-0 here against an definition. And speaking, I'm sure David would agree with this, as a parliamentarian with a parliamentary email address, I mean, it's unbelievable some of the stuff we receive. Gosh. Absolutely unbelievable. And we probably should be informing the police about more emails than we do. But there are so many of them, it's impossible to do it several times a day. Right, over to you. So let's have some hands up. Yes, in the second row over there's a microphone coming up. Remember to say loud and clear who you are and what you do.
Thanks. Oh, it's working, that's good. Hi, I'm Henry, and I'm a fellow this year, and the fellowship's been excellent thus far. So thank you for CEG for that. I had a question on your views on the current state of British political life, including some of the anger and the resentment and the bitterness that we've seen, and what that means for the future resilience of the British political system. And Lord Blunkett, you spoke about the actions that you took after 9/11, which included, for example, pushing through difficult legislation and driving it through with good scrutiny, in light of what is always going to be a very contentious topic. Could we do something like that again now, or are there fissures that are too deep that means we can't come back to do the work that we might need to in the future? Thank you.
David.
I think the situation is very different for the reasons I spelt out a few minutes ago. We are in a different world. My thinking on this is that if you're going to both heal wounds on the one hand and cauterize dangers of total intolerance and hate and bitterness on the other, you do have to be seen to act decisively. Now, you can have good colleagues who think they are acting decisively, but they're doing it in an incremental way, which means that very good things are being announced or worked on inside government, whether it's the Home Office or MOJ or whatever. And firstly, it doesn't have a resonance. It doesn't have purchase with the public because they hear the small announcements, but they don't see the big picture. So my strongest advice to my colleagues, if they would take it, is you need to package all the good things that you're doing and re-announce them with some very big seminal policy change. In my case, it would be a proper, well-organised, safeguarded identity verification system. And that then can work with and be seen to be part of a much bigger vision of how you're taking on the big challenges of the moment. If it were easy, any fool would have done it and we wouldn't be where we are today, and it isn't. But I'm really seriously concerned that the fragmented way in which our politics is now working and the populism that is obviously in the driving seat needs handling with decisiveness. And the only way to do that is a coherent, joined up set of policies that people can understand. It's about the big bang. It's more difficult to get your policy announcements across now, Alex and Jonathan, than it was in my day, because most people still watched the ITV or BBC News in the evening, but in their millions. Most people took a newspaper of some sort, and when my colleagues used to chide me about having articles in or doing interviews with the so-called enemy press, I used to say, well, at least the people who are taking that paper can read. It's the people that never read anything you need to worry about. And we can't do that anymore. The legacy press is not read by very large swathes of the population. I think the evening news on BBC is down to about 3 million. It was 12, 13, 14 million when I was Home Secretary. So the hegemony of government to people has changed, and it's been replaced by the social media noise.
Can I just take a straw poll in the room? You don't have to put your hands up, by the way. It's entirely voluntary, civil liberties here. But how many people in this room would have a very serious problem about the introduction of some form of either plastic or online identity cards, which is something that David just referred to? So hands up if you've got a really serious problem about it. Yeah, it's a very small minority. Jonathan, how would you deal with this question?
Well, I can't improve from what David said, and I'm not qualified to do so. The only thing I would say is that I still think that terrorism in Great Britain, and I'm distinguishing between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has quite a lot of cut-through. And I think that if you had, Henry, an attack or some pressing need to pass new legislation, I still think that in GB, you would get the attention that you need. And I only say that because I have done a lot of media in the last 6 years, including on radio phone-ins, including on social media, as well as on the classic broadcast media, etc. I think you probably will get some cut through. We also have one advantage in the UK, and this is just me thinking a bit with my state threats hat on, where the question of trust and democracy is very important, and the extent to which our democracy could be subverted by hostile actors. I do think we have the advantage of the BBC for all the criticism that I and other people would level against it. So I think those two things, the cut-through of counter-terrorism still and the BBC, probably mean that if you take David's advice, I still think you could do it.
By the way, Alex, I mean, before you go to the audience for a second question, I took a citizenship class in a secondary school earlier in the year, because I'm obsessed with teaching citizenship and democracy. So I was putting my hand to it again. There were 28 pupils in the class. There were 15 and 16-year-olds. The teacher was very good. And at the end, he said, "What, have you got a question for the students?" And I said, "Yes, I would like to know how many of you read a newspaper, how many of you regularly watch evening television news, and how many of you have been in one way or another touched by Andrew Tate." None of the 28 read a newspaper. 5 of them had regularly watched the evening news, and 16 of them had been affected by Andrew Tate.
Gosh.
That's if I can, there's a rider to that, which is that if you look at some of the studies that they do on social media consumption, the BBC does get quite a lot of coverage, I mean, say a lot of coverage on social media. So I think people may be consuming the BBC online as well as by TV.
Yeah, fair point.
Next question from the floor. Yes, with your right hand up there.
Good evening. My name's Noah and I'm a current fellow. My question is, in the wake of the Leicester riots between Pakistanis and Indians, or for example, more recent tensions between those that would describe themselves as pro-Israel and those that would describe themselves as pro-Palestine, it's hard to argue that we haven't effectively imported foreign conflicts. What is the impact of this on how we tackle extremism? Is the government as well equipped to deal with these new issues as it was with previous issues like the tensions in Northern Ireland, where we could work to form, the Good Friday Agreement, for example?
Jonathan.
Well, I think I would query one of the premises of your question, which is that there are sort of riots between Israelis and Jews and pro-Gaza supporters. I mean, there's been a lot of vitriol, certainly online. I'm not aware of any Jews or Israelis rioting. in the way that you suggest, and I probably wouldn't even characterise the way in which the pro-Palestinian demonstrators are operating as rioters, and I think that we have to be careful not to overstate. There was a desire under the previous government to look at changing terrorism legislation really on the basis these were all hate marches, and I think that's an unfair characterisation, and I think it's important to remember that however ugly it can be, these are points that people feel very strongly about. In terms of how do you deal with it, I don't know, you just got to roll with it, haven't you? I mean, this is just the way that terrorism and extremism works. No one foresaw the rise of Islamic State. No one saw the possibility of 9/11. I don't know the answer, but it's here, it's happening.
It's not new. My discussions with my opposite number in India, way back in 2002, 2003, were about their pressure on us to do something about what they saw as terrorist activity in the UK that affected them. This was about Sikh terrorism at the time, and our failure to act on it. Now, it wasn't a predominant issue for us, but it was for them. And I forget which bizarre politician from elsewhere described London in pejorative terms in respect of, was it the now President of the United States?
Either the President or I think both him and the Vice President.
Without any justification whatsoever. The flare-up in Leicester more recently was again about people putting out information and material that was grossly untrue. I mean, you touched, Hannah touched, I think, right at the beginning on the Lucy Connolly question. It's very interesting that if you are a middle-class white woman and you put out that people should burn down hotels and effectively murder people, somehow you're a hero of free speech. But if you are born in Pakistan and you do it, you're a terrorist.
I don't think there's enough, and I would put this to you, Jonathan, is there enough understanding in this country about the meaning of inchoate offences, the laws of incitement, for example, which were reflected in Lucy Connolly's sentence, most certainly?
Yeah, there was a total lack of communication in her case. I mean, I would have thought that most people, if you ask them, they would say that Lucy Connolly went to prison for a tweet and she didn't really mean it, when, as we all know from the judgment, she pleaded guilty on the basis she did. Can I just add something about, just picking up on your point, Noah, about the, I think the bigger question here on the national security front is the way that diasporas in this country can be vectors for state powers elsewhere. So if you have a country like Australia with a very large Chinese population, totally regular, normal Chinese population, amongst them you will have some people who are members of the United Front or influenced by the United Front Work Department. Worse, you'll have people who are totally wanting to get on with their lives, integrated, but they've got someone back home who is having pressure put on them to do things. And I think that is a real difficulty here. The presence of large diaspora groups does give an opportunity. I mean, Canada has had a massive falling out with India at the moment because it accused India of weaponizing against Sikhs within Canada. So I think that's the national dimension, that's the security dimension I should have mentioned. I mean, on inchoate offences, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, I think on the subject you were mentioning, I think you have some expertise in counter-subversion measures, which relate to what you were describing, really. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I gave a speech earlier this year where I talked about what I would do if I was a Russian intelligence officer. And I suppose I was really making the point, first of all, that just because we're Britain doesn't mean that we're immune from things going wrong. And secondly, that democracy cannot commit suicide. In other words, it's obviously right that we have really strong principles protecting free speech. It's obviously really right we have strong principles protecting freedom of association, but at the same time, we've got to recognise the fact that all those free speech rights that we want to enjoy ourselves will be used against us. In other words, people on social media will be stirring up the FSB, the Russian will be using social media and exercising their rights. And I suppose I was just drawing attention to something that's really uncomfortable, which is that back in the 1970s, there was such a thing as subversion. And Special Branch and MI5 would go around looking for people who are trying to undermine parliamentary democracy. That all went totally wrong because of the undercover policing activity, where they ended up having, would you believe it, sexual relationships with women who had no idea that they were cops, and in some cases children. So you can see why the word subversion has been jettisoned, but I just wonder whether or not we need to start thinking about it now.
Right. Can I just ask if there's any member of the media here who would particularly like to ask a question? Yeah.
Hello, Charles Hymans from the Daily Telegraph. I just wondered what your view was on non-crime hate incidents, given...
Sorry, on?
Non-crime hate incidents, and whether they should be scrapped, as some people would like to see.
David, non-crime hate incidents?
If it's not a crime, it's not a crime. We can have arguments about where the line can be drawn. People have historically expressed what we would call hate. It's when that hate is turned into something else, which brings you back to incitement for other people to take action on the back of the hate that they're spouting. We get hate mail, don't we? Yeah, all the time. And you just have to make a judgment as to whether this person is over the top and they are serious, including threats to life, and make a judgment that doesn't allow the parody of what you're doing. That's what I was trying to say earlier, about being very careful not to play into the hands of those who love the idea of showing us up and making a mockery of us, working in the shadows and encouraging other people to literally be their mouthpiece. So, I mean, we've just got to put up with and argue with and have a dialogue that overcomes hate, because it's always existed.
Jonathan, Charles's question.
Yeah, I'm a simple soul, and I think I would rather have something... The principle I apply with terrorism is either it's terrorism or it's not. This is why I've always been against the idea of extremism, because it's just too fudgy. And if you hand over that fudgy concept to the police, they're going to make mistakes, not because they're bad, but because they're human beings. So I think I would say clear away that clutter.
Yes, I think my view would be, there are people, I'm not one of them, who are very religious, and they're entitled to be very religious. But they may hold a belief that other people absolutely hate and regard as completely unreasonable. And I think they have to be prepared for that criticism to be made without it being designated as a crime. But if it goes over the line of, say, public order, then it will be a different consideration. And you rightly highlighted that point, Charles, because we're having a very complex debate about it in politics at the moment. Yes, who's next? Sir, yes, over there.
Hello, my name is Rudy. I'm an intern within the Fast Stream. My question was to take it back to the security services.
Speak up a bit, sorry.
My question was taking it back to the security services. There's clearly been some intelligence failures where perhaps MI5 and the police have not been united in their goals or kind of organisation in dealing with certain cases. For example, the loss of the White Widow, one of the brides of the 7/7 bombers in 2007, springs to mind. How can the government foster a united counter-terrorist purpose and message moving forward in this century?
I'm going to give my view first. I've been, as we all have, to various countries looking at all these issues. And I've seen divisions in many countries, some of whom are our close allies and members of the Commonwealth, between their home security services and their foreign security services, which generally speaking are extremely rare here. That would be my view. Yeah,
John le Carré sort of writ it large, didn't he?
Yeah.
So we got a bit of a view from the way this has been written up in fiction.
Yeah.
It does exist, but it doesn't exist to the point where it destroys their working relationships. I think historically there have been moments when Special Branch and counter-terrorism and MI5 have had difficulties.
Yeah, there's an issue about the organisation of police in this country,
Yeah.
which we still haven't addressed. You know, we've got 43 territorial police forces. We've got, I think it's 12 counter-terrorism units, which combine police forces. Those counter-terrorism units generally work much more efficiently than the 43 territorial police forces, which leaves a very simple conclusion that maybe we should only have about 12 police forces. Jonathan?
I don't think you're right at all, actually. I really don't. I mean, gosh, what I see is a really good working relationship. I know that there are, as Alex mentioned, extraordinary things with some overseas forces who don't share information. I mean, that is just not the way in which it works. I don't think, I mean, if you're talking about the sort of missed opportunities issue, I think you've just got to use the sort of emotional intelligence to say, imagine you're the analyst and you've got this piece of information, this piece of information, this piece of information. There is never some golden chain that if you tug on it, you're suddenly going to find the complete answer. And I mean, having had, you know, experience of quite a few of these cases, inquests, inquiries, seen behind the scenes, it's not the case that there's just some failure. There was in relation to the prison system, so and the probation service. So I did a couple of reports on that, and I remember going to a meeting of a multi-agency group shortly after the Streatham shooting. Do you remember that? The Streatham attacker stabbed some people, police officers turned up and shot him, thankfully. But after that, I was commissioned to do a report, and I remember going to a meeting. You had the probation service, who had the power to recall people to prison, and there were these two silent guys. And I said, "Oh, who are you?" They said, "Oh, we're from SO15." And I said, "Well, why are you here if you're not able to speak?" And they said, "Well, we can't tell you, sir." So I went to their boss, and eventually I ended up going to MI5 and finding out the information. But there was a problem there. But when it comes to your classic, what they call pursue, going after the bad guys, I think there's huge strengths here.
Yes. Yes, you, sir, in the aisle. And then somebody at the back put a hand up.
Hello, Joe Whittaker, Swansea University.
Sorry, you're going to have to speak up.
Sorry, Joe Whittaker, Swansea University and the Vauxhall Institute. I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on Prevent and how adept it is to the challenges we have in 2025. If you'd allow me, if you had kind of a magic wand and you could change one thing about Prevent for the better, what would it be?
I think I might start on this one because I did a Prevent review years ago, and I did half a Prevent review, though the Prevent reviewer who did the review is here, Sir William Shawcross, and he might want to say something. People say that Prevent is a failure because people are wrongly referred to Prevent. Yes, people are sometimes wrongly referred to Prevent. But the police arrest large numbers of people who are never charged with a criminal offence at all. And people are not saying the police shouldn't be allowed to arrest people because they make mistakes. And my experience, I had one particular experience in a room with three, they happened to be all Muslim men in one of our northern cities who were running Prevent programs in their city. And I said to them, what about all the objections to Prevent? Why are you doing it, contrary to the views of many in your community? And one of them, speaking for them all, said, I'm doing it because of what it says on the tin. We are preventing people, mostly young men, from becoming terrorists. And by and large, it works. And there are some very good stories about individuals who've been persuaded by Prevent. But my answer to your question, what would I change about Prevent? I would make it much more uniform in the way in which it's applied. I think that the way in which decisions to refer people to Prevent made by so-called channel panels are inconsistent. And I think that Prevent should be put under a much more national framework with standards. And I think, where is Sir William Shawcross? I can't see William. It's right at the back. I think that's very much
Over to
part
you,
of
William,
what
yeah.
you said. Do you want to say anything, William, on Prevent? So William Shawcross.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here and to listen to you all. It's been a fascinating conversation. I did do a Prevent report a couple of years ago, and some of my colleagues who worked with me on it are here, and it was a huge responsibility, I felt, and a very important area to look in. One of the problems that we found was that in local government and in schools and even in the police force, many people were frightened of talking about Islamist terrorism and the threat of it because they were frightened of being called racist. And this was a serious inhibition, we found, that probably is growing still. And it was a problem that I identified in the report. And along with other recommendations, which the Home Secretary at the time said, who was Suella Braverman, said she would see they were all implemented. Unfortunately, she didn't last very long in government, and many of the recommendations that we made, which were serious recommendations for improving the efficacy of Prevent, which I think is a very important policy, have not yet been made. But I think that let's hope that this government will look at the recommendations again and implement them. There was someone else said a little bit earlier, if I may go back to that I may have misheard this, that the massive anti-Semitic demonstrations that we've seen on the streets of London ever since October the 7th, almost every weekend, are something that we just have to live with. Well, that's not the view of my Jewish friends. Most of the Jews I know in London have become I shouldn't say most, many of the Jews whom I know in London have become very frightened of London, the centre of London, particularly on Saturdays. And I think that wave of anti-Semitism, which is completely unprecedented, I never thought that we would see British citizens and others marching down Whitehall shouting death to the Jews. But that is what we have seen over the last 2 years, and it's hard to see how that's going to be stopped. But I think it's something about which we should all be very, very concerned and shocked.
Anything on Prevent, David?
Well, I'm sorry that more of your recommendations weren't implemented, but I wasn't sorry that Suella Braverman bit the dust. I have to be honest with you. I think the clarity you talked about, Alex, is absolutely fundamental as to what are the criteria, how are they applied, is there consistency. I'd like to see the issues of the debate and dialogue in schools inculcated into the citizenship curriculum so that it isn't standing out on its own. It's about how young people can address these really critical issues, that they can be encouraged to speak in an open way that doesn't automatically get them picked up and put into channel, but actually can flag where there's something very much more serious going on, and then to be able to deal with it. But the primary concern is to actually get people to be able to speak honestly and openly and to have their views challenged, because that's the essence of a thriving democracy.
Yeah. Jonathan?
I mean, just briefly, that I've spoken at and with quite a lot of very anti-Prevent people, and in the end of the day, they all accept, I think, that the idea of Prevent is a very sound one. You know, if you had lots of American school shooters, you would want to have some program where teachers said, oh, he's talking about the Matrix too much and talking about coming in. We need to get him referred to someone. So the principle, it seems to me, is completely sound.
Like the young woman who was obsessed with military equipment. And
Yes,
Yeah.
very recent, yes. Yes, there's at the back over there by Catherine.
Thanks.
Could you stand up, because we
Sure.
can't see you at all? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Ollie. I work at the Home Office. I wanted to ask about protests, which we've touched on a few times. And so during the 90s or 80s with Salman Rushdie, and 90s with kind of cartoons, and then into 2000s
Speak up a bit, sorry.
2000s with the Iraq War, we had a wave of protests which led to radicalization and to actual kind of groups forming and violence being carried out. There were some predictions this would happen after, or as a result of the Palestine-Gaza marches, which we haven't yet seen. We're also seeing a wave of asylum protests that are becoming increasingly hostile and violent in the face of kind of perceived political inaction. Could you talk a bit about both Gaza protests and asylum protests and their potential to lead to waves of violent, explicitly violent kind of terrorist action? Thanks.
David?
The massive demonstrations that, because I was obviously in the thick of the decision making, the massive demonstrations about Iraq were about our actions, and they didn't feed over into the shadows of other people's agendas, because what we're talking about tonight is people who have a very clear agenda, and they look for formats and avenues for being able to inculcate that and to use others in a way that those people who are being used don't know. People who demonstrate in a particular way because they, in their hearts, they're really concerned, are not the problem. The problem are the ones who are manipulating them. And that is really difficult to get to, which is why these issues are so difficult. I think that the current hate spills over when serious politicians start talking about their daughters being at risk from asylum seekers. There may be a handful of asylum seekers who are genuinely a risk in one way or another, and we should deal with them in the way we would deal with anyone else in those circumstances. But if we get off on the wrong foot and that kind of attitude takes off, it's very hard to pull it back. And it, by the way, it diverts us from the real task that we've been thrashing out tonight, which is those that put us at risk, that use our democracy against us, who are prepared to undermine everything we stand for. And they're not the ones that the street protests are about. And that's the dangerous thing at the moment. It's a total diversion from the reality of what's going on under the surface.
You mentioned the online harms legislation earlier. Do you think that's a way of remedying some of the problems you're highlighting?
In part, but this is another function of good policing, to be able to sift, to monitor, to be able to understand what's taking place. And I don't think we equip our policing services anywhere near enough for dealing with that new environment. It's like the squares that people used to police historically. It's the Dixon of Dr. Green walking down a street and spotting something that was amiss. But now we've got to be able to do that online. And I don't think we equip our police services to do it. And when you ask them to find people who are clearly threatening you from inside prison, and with all the techniques of triangling and interception, they can't find out who's got the mobile phone in a prison, I worry.
Jonathan?
I mean, on that, I think that our police are held back by the Data Protection Act and RIPA. I think that just as the tech companies use sophisticated techniques to scan their content and to carry out sentiment analysis and to create profiles about individuals for the purposes of marketing, I think that our police ought to have the powers to do the same to find the bad guys. The problem is, as I know from looking at RIPA, which is the law that regulates surveillance, it's very hard to create a profile of someone online, if you're the authority, without having to get some sort of warrant or sign-off from a senior police officer. I mean, next year, my last report as reviewer, I'm going to try and look at how you can reconcile using modern tech, which we all use, with the mission to find the bad guys. On the protest point, I just mentioned the protest point. I think you need real intellectual clarity about what protests are and what they aren't. And I think there has been some muddling here. We're not America, and so we have the advantage of Section 19 of the Public Order Act, which is the offence of stirring up racial hatred. So where you have people calling for the deaths of Jews, use that unashamedly. Where you've got, and this is a mention of Palestine Action, where you've got a group that is not in fact expressing views, but simply taking direct action in order to effectively blackmail the state into discontinuing relations with Israel or arms or anything of that. It's not trying to express its views, in fact it's trying to shut down views. Well, I think that's not protest. And I think the middle bit, where people really are expressing views, does require a huge amount of protection. I don't think we're going to be able to tell whether this round of protests is going to lead to an uptick in domestic terrorism. The weird paradox is that many people thought after the 7th of October there would be a huge uptick, and there hasn't been so far.
Right, who's next? Yes, near the aisle. Oh, sorry. No. I'll do as Catherine tells me, and then we'll come to that gentleman next.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kalyan. I work for Cross Advisory. I have a question based on what seems to be emerging evidence that the terrorist threat is moving from defined ideology to diffuse ideology, and that it seems that there's more and more evidence coming out that the common thread in recruitment of young men in particular is extreme misogyny. And as you were referring to earlier, Lord Blunkett, we know that exposure to extreme misogyny and content that is radicalizing is extremely high and poorly controlled in terms of our young men and our boys, particularly in our schools. And we also know that the Online Safety Act doesn't necessarily give teeth to deal with that. So I was wondering what you thought the classic counter-terrorism measures could do in addressing the extremely high volume of this content that we know, if you pull on that thread, often can lead, but not always, to terrorism.
David?
I don't think that our counter-terrorism laws can deal with it. I think this is a major societal problem, and it needs a multiplicity of approaches in terms of what happens in our schools, in terms of parenting, in terms of how we teach young women to deal with the consequences of this misogyny. And the people I referred to earlier are incited by Andrew Tate and his brother. But it's not terrorism. It's insidious and it's vile, but I don't think counter-terrorism legislation can deal with this at all.
Jonathan?
I agree. It comes from the internet, and I think that children should not be on the internet, frankly. I mean, we will go through 5 or so years of twiddling with the Online Safety Act. There's a case that's just been mounted in the US by 2 massive purveyors of misogyny, the sites 4chan and Kiwi Farms. They are seeking a ruling, and they may well be successful, from the district court in America to say, although Ofcom have told us that we've got to comply with our online safety duties, we've got an absolute right to free speech. And I think that very soon we're going to realise the limits to UK power. Although we're a good market for the tech companies, we've got no power. And I think the UK needs to find a better way of translating our market share into power. And I expect the only thing we can do in practice, because of where these tech companies are located, is to start to remove children from the internet.
The question you raised is an immensely difficult one, because the horse has bolted to a great extent. I went into a school in a northern town in which one of my grandchildren was at the time a pupil, and it rained at break time. So when the bell went for break, all these children, then I was particularly interested in the class of 6-year-olds, went to a little space, pulled iPads out of drawers and started playing on the iPads, much more skillfully than I could at the time anyway. And once they have that access, they're going to want more and more access, and it's very difficult to police it indeed. So it's a moral question as much as a physical question. Yes, schools, in my view, should not let children take mobile phones into class, of course. but there are other issues that are much more difficult to address. You were Secretary of State for Education at one time,
Yeah.
David. It's a real challenge, isn't it?
Thank God we didn't have it then. It's, one of I had lots of problems, but that wasn't one of them.
You obviously have a lot of knowledge about this. Did you want to add anything? You, yes, the questioner.
Putting me on the spot. I guess I have two, for me I have perhaps three concerns. Firstly, I have a concern around how we stop the volume of content getting onto the surfaces and the interfaces that are consumed by children. And it seems to me, as you were saying, that there should be perhaps alliances that are formed with other countries that are shared markets with us, perhaps looking towards Europe, where we could develop some regulatory teeth. And there's a question about getting kids off. So there's a question about the volume of the input. Then I have a second question, which is, what are the protective factors for young men and boys to help them develop healthy relationships in their own lives? And then my third question is, you have a huge cohort that is exposed to hate and misogyny, and we know that at particularly certain ages that is kind of accepted to a certain extent. But then only a few of them in that cohort will go on to be persuaded by those hooks, not only to commit acts of misogyny, but then to go into terrorism groups. And so for me, there's also a question of how you monitor risk throughout the development of a child who may be exposed to that content. I don't really have answers. I'm just trying to break down the problem a little bit more.
Let's just take another straw poll. How many people here are satisfied with the way in which the online service, the internet service providers, do the moderation of content on their servers in order to try and remove such sites from public availability? Anybody think they're doing a good job? One brave vote there. Anyone think they're doing a bad job or no job at all? Yeah. Yeah, and right.
We're a bit in danger of groupthink here, aren't we?
We are, yeah. But I mean, I asked the question for a reason, because there are jurisdictional issues here, legal issues here, and it is possible for us to place for Parliament, inspired by the government, to place on the statute book laws that could result in internet service providers being fined huge sums of money, measured in a percentage of their worldwide turnover, for failing to moderate their sites in a reasonable and proper way. We've been rather reluctant to, and it's done, for example, in anti-competitive legislation. Huge fines are sometimes imposed, and maybe we should be looking at that as part of the solution, at least. You know, there needs to be a stick, perhaps, rather than just carrots.
I don't think we should duck the fact that it's made triply difficult by the current regime in the States. Because normally you would be dealing with the big tech, and you would be dealing with them with a degree of equality. If the American government join in, as they are doing, behind big tech, whatever they do, then you're in real difficulties.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember how small some of the most dangerous sites are. I mean, I think Telegram, which is, I'll call it a dangerous site because a lot of extreme right-wing terrorism and some Islamic State terrorism is found on there. I think they had, and Adam Hadley's in the audience will know, I think they had 100 employees, and most of those would be engineers, and they might have half a lawyer. So, you know, the amount of content that these groups can carry is so different to their actual size. And when you think where they are, Durov, whatever his name is, probably based in the UAE at the moment, they may have no physical assets in the UK. If you go and get some court order, there's no way of affecting judgment against them, unless you can persuade the host country to implement the order, and they probably won't.
The gentleman, just in front of Lord Wolney, the gentleman in front of Lord Wolney wanted to ask a question. So, sir, yes.
Or behind, I think.
Oh, you didn't? Sorry.
We won't force you into it.
What about the hand right at the very back of the room? No, you go first, then the hand at the back, and then we'll be finishing.
My name's Aniket. I work on AI governance. My question is, it seems like a recurring theme throughout the discussion is that government policy is almost always reactive with issues like this. So counter-terrorism matters as an issue. It has cut through after there's an attack, or there was loads of complacency pre-9/11. And my question was, how can we kind of change incentives to engage in much more preemptive policy? Because ideally, we wouldn't want a situation where there's good policy, but only after attacks have happened.
Well, I think I should put this to you, David, because you introduced a lot of legislation that attempted to do just that, to be proactive.
Was difficult to be futurist. We used to have debates, I don't think they have them at the moment, but we used to have debates about how could we look to 10, 15, 20 years ahead and anticipate in whatever area, not just in counter-terrorism and dealing with extremism, but in a whole range of areas, including education. What is round the corner? What can we do? In terms of legislating on it, you've got a problem, because legislation often comes from a tide of opinion that carries you through. So you get a majority, and obviously political parties are not as good at whipping as they used to be, as my party found before the summer break. The tide that you've got running, the imperative of acting, the demand that government should move, carries you with it. The futurist stuff doesn't allow you that. You can prepare and think it through, although turnover in the civil service is such, and now I was talking to Charles earlier, in the media is such. So even the BBC have now moved out many of their specialist reporters who have got a grasp of history. They've got some measure of understanding of what happens now and its relationship to the past and therefore the future. So it's more difficult than it would seem, because politics is always the art of the possible, and the best politicians are the ones that use their political power, their, if you like, their rhetoric. We're not into rhetoric a lot these days, except from the far right. They've captured the rhetoric. The rhetoric to make space for yourself to be able to do something, to be able to carry people with you, to mobilize, if you like, a view that other people will then take on board. It's not easy. And I just don't want Farage to be the one who's able to do it. I don't think this guy who's been elected from the Greens is going to do it. He believes he's the new Messiah.
He's a hypnotist.
Well, he is. He's not hypnotising me, that's for sure. And I wish him and Jeremy all the very best. It's a marriage made in hell.
Jonathan.
I mean, can I say what a total privilege to hear David speak about this. I mean, he knows whereof he speaks so much. All I would add is, I think reactive is probably better than the alternative, and I'd be pretty careful what you wish for. I mean, you could imagine creating an all-singing, all-dancing legislation that deals with every potential possible risk. It would probably be a nightmare, and it could be badly misused. So I think probably better to react.
Last question right at the back.
My name is Darius Nasimi from the Afghanistan and Central Asian Association. I have a question for David. During your time as Home Secretary, you were involved in implementing several counter-terrorism measures. How did 9/11 reshape the way you viewed the threat of terrorism? And how do you think the return of the Taliban to Afghanistan in August 2021 is going to present a greater threat to British national security? And the other question, which is more general, was in your view, what role does international cooperation play in counter-terrorism, and how can the UK improve its alliances in this area?
I'll try and be brief, Alex, on
you answer the first one, and he'll
then
answer the second one.
Okay, good. What did it do? It woke me up. It actually made it possible for me to understand some of the things we're talking about all these years later, in circumstances where I'd obviously thought about some of the bigger issues. I was very interested in Tony Blair's Chicago speech in 1999, and his perception of what was happening globally and the threat that it posed and the need for us to be aware and alert. So I'd being close to Tony, and I still am, I was really interested in that point of view. But the attack was, I hate the term wake-up call, because it wasn't. It was a smash that actually said, you've got to do something, and you've got to do it rapidly, not think about it forever. You've got to have a clear view on what's necessary and carry colleagues with you in bringing it into being. And you might make mistakes. But as I said earlier, our democracy actually worked well. Our parliament, the two elements of our parliament, worked well and came up with a moderated bill which stood the test of time, despite the arguments about Part 4. And just to be very brief on the second question, you can't deal with any of these issues without international collaboration. And whatever's happening with Donald Trump, etc., the services that serve us, the links that they have with each other on a daily basis are crucial to our well-being. And so long as they're not blocked off, then what GCHQ do with the NSA and all the rest in the States is really important.
Jonathan.
I mean, just to add, I mean, cooperation on terrorism is so important and so frequent. It's a bit more difficult when you're dealing with state threats. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's imagine, for example, you had some Nord Stream pipeline that's blown up or damaged by some ship and everyone suspects it's Russia. Well, that's a bit more difficult, isn't it? Because different European countries who may need to cooperate in terms of working out where the planning was done, any intelligence they've got, they may have very different attitudes towards, for example, Russia, depending on their economic relation. They may be hoping to get gas after the end of the war in Ukraine, for example. So I think that there's a common ground on terrorism, and the government has got the ability to work with all sorts of people. It's a lot harder when it comes to state threats.
Thank you. Right, well, I want to thank CEG, the very busy team at CEG, for organising this evening's events. I want to thank you for coming and asking so many very interesting questions. You've had the opportunity to hear from a really brilliant independent reviewer of terrorism legislation who's done wonderful work in recent years, and also one of the great political greats of the United Kingdom. So I hope you've enjoyed the evening. Thank you for coming, and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you.